Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Brenton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, flying solo for a little bit here. We got Stephen Lassan back for his weekly appearance. Gonna do a real deep dive here on Auburn's coaching search now that Bryan Harsin officially fired. If you missed it, we did a little emergency podcast here Monday afternoon as soon as that was officially announced by the Auburn Tigers. We've got some other news and notes around the league, and we preview all the games, including a big old deep dive on the two huge matchups, Tennessee at Georgia, Alabama at LSU with Stephen. So it was a great show, but let's just get right into it because so much to cover here, and we got to start on the plains. Something I hit on in that emergency podcast, most likely interim candidate there for the Auburn Tigers. Running backs coach Cadillac Williams has been named the interim coach there for the Auburn Tigers, and they say they are going to run the hell out of the ball down there. Finally, get Tank and Jarquez going. That's your best bet if you're an Auburn Tigers. It would be fascinating to see how they respond against Mississippi State this weekend without Harsin. Not that Harsin was holding them back or anything, although he kind of was, but it'd just be interesting to see. Also because, hey, Cadillac's been making moves. He may be trying to win this job. He's fired the offensive coordinator, Eric Cassell. He's fired the tight ends coach, Brad Biddle. He's fired the recruiting coordinator. He's fired Harsin's chief of staff. He's hired the general manager and director of scouting and development. All those people gone immediately after Harsin let go here on Monday. So, hey, this is going to be a new direction for them Auburn Tigers. And leading the charge, of course, John Cohen has officially been announced, the former Mississippi State AD, now Auburn AD. And it's just fascinating that it's the same game week here. Auburn at Mississippi State, AD jumping ship midweek. That's fascinating, but also interesting. It was reported that Auburn made a run at Arkansas AD, Hunter Yurachek, and Arkansas managed to lock him down with a contract extension and a raise. We all know the fine work that Yurachek has done there at Arkansas. So hired Sam Pittman, turned around the football program, hired Eric Musselman, turned around the basketball program, their baseball, one of the best in the SEC. Things have been great at Arkansas. I believe if you look at all the sports, all the championships here in recent years, Arkansas leads the way. So Hunter Yurachek doing just an outstanding job. I believe he came over from Houston, but the fact that he said no to Auburn, that's got to give you a little pride here if you're an Arkansas Razorback. And after that was reported, Yurachek released a statement here. I'll throw it up on Twitter, just kind of confirming his commitment to Arkansas. But it's fascinating. Auburn looking for basically any SEC AD willing to jump down there on the plains. Treacherous job in some sense with the boosters and all the people, their hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. But again, this is a program that can win the national championship. They should be competing for SEC championships. They're so close to Georgia. Alabama's loaded with talent. Not to Georgia's level, but you're close to Florida. You border Tennessee. You border Mississippi. I mean, their radius from their school, you can build a championship roster. Of course, we know that with just their recent history and Alabama and Georgia, what they've been able to do. So, an ideal position if you can get everyone moving in the right direction. That's going to be the biggest challenge of John Cohen's career, along with nailing this football hire, this all-important football hire. And of course, speaking of that, so Mississippi State now without an AD, and we had Mike Leach, as only he could, giving his advice to the next AD, whoever that may be there in Starkville.
Obviously, you've been at Mississippi State a few years now. I guess what would your pitch be, to a new person interested in being the athletic director? Why is being the athletic director at Mississippi State a good job in your eyes?
Oh, I think it's a great job because this is a great place to live, and then also, the people you work with are great too. At least, it's not perfect. I would definitely purge a couple, but not very many. I mean, less here than most places. And so that immediately sticks it above, other places. So I think it's a fantastic place. I think it's a very down-to-earth place. And I think it's a pragmatic place that, that tries to figure out solutions to problems rather than get wound up, politically kissing too many rings. I mean, they're trying to solve the problem, which is, I think, the correct approach. And then I think that, hang on, I got a cough. And then, the biggest thing, you want a guy that really wants to be here, really wants to do it, and you want a guy that stays out of your way, that understands that, the coaches for all the sports, they're there for a reason, and the athletic director's role is to provide support, not coach, And those athletic directors are the best ones. I've been really lucky. I've been around some great athletic directors. When I was at Kentucky, C.M. Newton was the athletic director. When I was at Oklahoma, Joe Castiglione was the athletic director. When I was at Washington State, Bill Moose was the athletic director. So we need somebody that's like really either of those three. As a matter of fact, maybe we ought to call Bill. Who knows?
So I just had to play that. I mean, that was too good not to play on this episode. But next, hey, let's move it on down to Florida, where coming off a big loss against your arch rival Georgia, big game here on the road at Texas A&M. And how's the week start? Brenton Cox, one of your best players, dismissed from the team. And it was interesting because this was reported, I believe, by On3 Sports before anybody. And Trey Dean, defensive back down there in Gainesville, he tweeted, "This is not true." But of course it was true. Billy Napier confirmed it himself. It's just a sign of what's going on down there. I mean, a lack of communication, players, active players, not knowing who's on the team, who's been dismissed. Certainly this happened this morning, perhaps, and word just didn't leak out, but not a good look. Now, again, Cox, I have no idea what he did, but if he was causing an issue, if he wasn't buying into the Billy Napier era, you're better off without him. No players above the team. And here's what old Billy Napier had to say on this. Again, as you'd expect, he's not giving much specifics, but he did confirm the news. Brenton Cox no longer with the team.
Just comment on the situation with Brenton and his status.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking that question. Brenton, we've kind of decided to move on here. I think, I think that being a football player at the University of Florida is a privilege, right? And there's certain expectations and standards that come with that. Brenton's been here in his third year. Obviously, he's done a lot of good things for the University of Florida, and we wish him nothing but the best. But sometimes you have to make decisions in the best interest of the team, and certainly Brenton, we're going to do everything we can do to help him with his transition. But as simple as that, I think that we've decided to move on.
Did he throw a punch at the end of that game against Georgia? Did Brenton throw a punch at the end of that game against Georgia?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so what was the issue here with him? I mean, you're talking about just moving on. Like, what did he do or didn't do that prompted this decision?
I don't know that we would get specific relative to to what caused the decision. I think it's more of a cumulative effect here.
And adding a little interesting little, and to add just slightly to this story, This is pretty wild. I mean, I almost hesitate to even play this clip, but I don't know that I've seen or heard of this in the SEC. Year one with a coach. Hot mic here. We'll play it on the YouTube. It makes better sense if you're watching on YouTube, but these press conferences, a lot of times what happens is you're sitting around, you're waiting for the coach to arrive. The mic was rolling. YouTube, sometimes they're filming. They're running just an empty podium. The mic is hot. These reporters clearly did not realize that the mic was recording what they were saying. And one of them, I'll try to turn it up so you can hear it. He's basically having an exchange with another reporter, and they're discussing how tough to go at Billy Napier. And one of them says, "I don't give a fuck. I'll be here longer than Billy Napier. I can promise you that." Let's play that clip.
Yeah, I do care, and I don't really want to say push it out. That's Jack.
And that's fine. And I respect that. I really do. I don't give a fuck though.
It's fine. I'm gonna get, dude, you're gonna be ripping my
I will
butt
be
on the
here.
podcast.
I will be here longer than Billy Napier. I can promise that. I can't.
Are we on for all day today?
Yeah, you are. I'm not. I've got a long-term deal.
So I sent this over to Cousin Shane, and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with what he just said. That reporter, he may be there a long time. So there's some truth to that. Billy Napier in year one. But again, this is not what you want to be hearing about your head coach. I realize things are not going well for Billy Napier year one. I didn't see that coming, but it's not like this is stunning. I mean, they're, for the most part, kicking ass on the recruiting trail. I realize they missed on a big 5-star the other day. They've got other 5-stars they're after. They've not landed a 5-star, I don't believe, under his tenure. But hell, we've not even had a full recruiting cycle down there. He's got a top 10 recruiting class. Things are trending in the right direction. I'm not selling stock in Billy Napier, but it's just fascinating that we've got a media member saying this about the head coach at a damn press conference before the coach walks in. Again, the only thing I can say was similar to this was I heard basically a similar comment about Butch Jones at SEC Media Days, but this was even a South Carolina reporter that was saying that, the Butch, his ass, he'll be gone before you know it. This was at 2017 Media Days, and about 3 months later, Butch was fired. So, hey, guess that guy knew what he was talking about, huh? And we'll find out if this guy knows what he's talking about Billy Napier. 2 other quick little items here before we get to our interview with Stephen Lassan. I just thought this was hilarious. Brian Kelly, some people hate him, some people love him. They sure do love him down there in Baton Rouge, and they'll love him a lot more if he can beat Nick Saban. But apparently it's Nick Saban's birthday. Halloween, how interesting. Sold his soul to the devil, if I had to guess. Brian Kelly wishes Nick Saban a happy birthday.
Well, it's a big day, as you know. It's Nick Saban's birthday, so I want to wish him a happy birthday to start this off, and maybe that'll soften things up a little bit. But you can always start a press conference by throwing a little happy birthday wish out to your opposing coach.
I just thought that was funny. He's got a weird sense of humor, but I like it. And last but not least, Kentucky. That offensive performance was god-awful against Tennessee. You scored 6 points. No need to rehash all that. But Mark Stoops ain't taking it, lying down. He is... He didn't mention Rick Scangarello here, but clearly that's who he's talking about. Not happy with the offense. Not happy with his play caller. Mark Stoops, shots fired for his offensive coordinator.
Mark, I asked you after the game just about overall the state where the offense is right now. After you watch the film, kind of just where do you think the progress has been made, and are you so confident that this is the system that works?
Well, I mean, obviously you're not very pleased with that result. I mean, that's hard to say after a game like that because, once again, I mean, I'm smart enough not to get a headline out of me with acting like I'm pleased with that performance, because I'm clearly not, and nobody should be. So you have to always look at things and evaluate things and see the good and the bad and where you're falling short and what else you're going to do. I mean, there's nothing drastic. I mean, you certainly better look at it and you better address it and you better get it fixed or you're not going to last. But again, we've been through it, and there's some areas where everybody can do better. Where we could certainly coach better, we could put them in better position. Guys can step up and make plays. We could, personnel, you name it, injury, but there's enough blame to go around, and we are constantly evaluating, constantly looking at things and striving to be better.
Ooh, boy. Now, I mean, if that's what he's saying in a press conference, I can only imagine what he's saying behind closed doors, but this is vastly different. I've seen it from South Carolina people already. This is vastly different than what old Shane Beamer, the approach down there. And this, Mark Stoops, say what you want about him. He has been in the SEC a long time. He knows what the hell he's talking about. He knows how to stay in this league. He knows how to be competitive in this league for a long, long time. And he's hitting the nail on the head. This offense ain't getting it done. We better get this fixed, or your ass gonna be gone. I love this. I really do. And maybe this lights a fire under somebody's ass up there in Lexington. And maybe they stop doing promos with Steve Zahn and study that playbook. I don't know. But whatever the issue is, got to get it fixed with some big-time SEC games and a rivalry to close out the season in Kentucky. Remember, Kentucky's not even bowl eligible yet. So they have still got work to do, and it's got to start with this offense turning the corner. That's all the audio clips that I got prepared for you guys. Let's kick it over to our interview with Steven Lassan, Athlon Sports. All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by friend of the show, Steven Lassan. Of course, you know him from Athlon Sports. Give him a follow at AthlonSteven on Twitter. And don't forget to check out his outstanding YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Steven, thanks for joining us once again. How you doing, my friend?
Hey, Mike, it's good to talk to you, especially on a week where there's nothing going on in the SEC, slow matchups, slow news. No, in all seriousness, it's great to talk to you, and looking forward to breaking down what should be a potentially monumental week in the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, a monster weekend, Steven. Of course, that's what we really want to talk to you about on this episode. But, we all got thrown, I don't want to call it a curveball because I think we all knew it was coming, but why in the world Auburn decided to fire Brian Harsin, a week following a bye will remain a mystery. But we know you at Athlon, that's a lot of what you guys do, replacements. You talk to coaches year round. So let's start right there, Steven. Brian Harsin, given the axe at Auburn, who are some of the top candidates in your mind to take over as the next coach on the Plains?
I think there's a couple obvious candidates here, and I think we can look at the last search as sort of a tell of where this one is going. And by that, I mean, they're going to hire somebody who's got experience in the SEC. John Cohen, of course, being the new athletic director coming over from Mississippi State, it kind of tells us where everything is going to go, and rightfully so. I think Auburn needs a coach who can definitely embrace recruiting much more than Brian Harsin did. And not to mention, I think just knows the SEC ins and outs. So I think it's, the list for candidates for me starts with Lane Kiffin over at Ole Miss, because I think he certainly understands the SEC. But more than anything, I think Lane gets the 2022, 2023 era of college football, which is NIL, transfer portal, recruiting, how to build a team. I think he gets all that. And he's a great fit, of course, in the SEC. He would be at the top of the list for me. Hugh Freeze is another name. I mean, his stint at Ole Miss, he's been winning at Liberty. I also think, in terms of just SEC experience and all that, he's got it at being the head coach at Ole Miss before. So I think just having coaches with SEC background experience, offense, transfer portal, NIL experience, like both those names to me check off the boxes. I wouldn't be surprised if some other names get into it, but to me, like those seem to be the two coaches that are probably the most likely to be the next coach at Auburn.
That's interesting, Steven. So let me let's start with Lane Kiffin, because we all know he's doing a heck of a job down there at Ole Miss. Like you said, he's the portal king down there, so he could flip this roster fairly quickly, I would assume. And, I should have mentioned it, reports, they tried to hire away Arkansas's AD, so it goes to your point. They're trying to stay within the SEC. Obviously, getting John Cohen speaks to that, and he's been in that state, seen what Lane Kiffin's done. Lane Kiffin undefeated against Mississippi State in that Egg Bowl rivalry. So let me ask you this. At Ole Miss, I spoke with Neil McCready a couple weeks ago, and I asked him this kind of the same thing. Why would Lane Kiffin stay there when it seems like every offseason we got to hear the rumor mill about Lane and Miami and this job and that job, and even Auburn? Apparently a year ago he was kind of posturing to try to get in down there. I guess what I'm trying to ask you, Stephen, is all the hoopla. I mean, he is basically the face of Ole Miss. And if he's Auburn's coach, he's not going to be the face of Auburn. I truly don't believe. I mean, they even got his freaking dog, Stephen, as like the unofficial mascot of Ole Miss, and he gets away with murder down there. Do you think that would be an issue at Auburn, or do you think they would just kind of hand him the keys and say, well, he's a hell of a coach, develops these quarterbacks, develops offenses, adapts to his personnel? I mean, he does check a ton of the boxes that you just referenced, but I don't know if it would be the Lane Kiffin show on the plains, if that makes sense. Is that an obstacle at all in your mind?
It's a good question. I think the things that I keep going back to about Auburn are you can win a national championship here. I think you can at Ole Miss. I just think it probably takes more to fall into your category. You need a lot more to break right. And especially maybe in the era of the 12-team playoff going forward, that helps teams like Ole Miss a lot. You don't, now you have to get past Alabama. In the 12-team era, you could get to second and still make the 12-team playoff. So I think opportunities for places like Ole Miss get better in a 12-team playoff as far as chasing the national championship. But when it comes to Auburn, they have everything that you want to win a national championship. I mean, they have access to top flight talent. I think based upon reporting, they're ready to go all in on NIL. We know Lane can do the transfer portal. Money's not going to be an issue. I mean, look at the buyouts to Gus Malzahn and Brian Harsin. I mean, they're going to pay those guys, insane amounts of money to not coach. So I think, to me, if you're looking at this just from the view of like, what's the better job, it is Auburn. So I think that would weigh heavily in my mind. Now, to your point on being the face of the program, yeah, I could see that, like, as far as being like, maybe he goes to Auburn and isn't necessarily the face of that program. But I also think Lane Kiffin can make himself into the kind of the show at Auburn because of his ability to, we see what he does on Twitter all the time. We saw what he did Saturday night to Jimbo Fisher. He sort of just is sort of the kind of the ringleader when you go to a program. And so I don't know if it's necessarily an obstacle. I think if you're Lane Kiffin and you're looking at it from national championship potential, where can you win at a higher level? I think it's Auburn. And to me, if I was weighing the two jobs, that would weigh. The other thing is always, when it comes to Auburn, is all the other stuff, the alignment, that we saw in the last coaching search. And that would be a question that I think Auburn has to answer going forward. Now, it does seem like by hiring John Cohen and some of the other things that we've seen, they are trying to get aligned going forward. So that, to me, might be the biggest sticking point in all that, is selling to coaches that all that stuff that happened in the past and the last coaching search and then after the 2021 season, that's in the past. Auburn's ready to move forward.
Now, Hugh Freeze, the other name you mentioned, Stephen, I got to be completely transparent. I'm not a fan of him personally. Kind of had some dealings with him, but hey, I'm trying to take off my my biased hat here. He's everything you want in an SEC coach. Fun offense, develops quarterbacks. He's beaten everybody in the league. He's kind of a scumbag, which you got to be to recruit in this conference at times, particularly in this NIL era. So there's a lot to like about Hugh Freeze, but let me ask you this, because John Cohen was at Mississippi State for so long, we all know the history there. I mean, that was the most vitriolic rivalry in the SEC for people that know that well. I mean, they literally made documentaries on the shenanigans behind the scenes, Dan Mullen, Hugh Freeze, with John Cohen being involved in that university. I just don't think that there's any way he can look past that. Do you think that would be a sticking point for John Cohen to hire Hugh Freeze at Auburn?
Yeah, I do. I think it can be. I think the other part of this is too, from the alignment at Auburn and like you're trying to get everybody from boosters to president to AD to get everybody on the same page. And like the question is going to be like, who do they want? And if they really want Hugh Freeze and if they're really going to get aligned and they're going to get all this money and everything to NIL, I think it could happen. But I think to your point, yeah, I think there is some concerns about that. Plus, I just think the baggage that comes from what happened at Ole Miss, yes, it has been a few years, but also I just, would someone in the SEC office be okay with that coming in? Would it be okay for Hugh Freeze to come back to the SEC? So I think there are some obstacles that have to be overcome. Just my personal belief is I don't know that there's anything that would necessarily block. Like it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's a head coach in the SEC in the next couple of years. It just seems like it just checks off too many boxes, like you said. I mean, if you're Auburn, and you need to put some pressure on Kirby Smart and Nick Saban, the two coaches that do it on all the lists are Lane Kiffin and Hugh Freeze because of their ability to recruit, go into the portal, NIL, and not to mention the way that they run offenses and can recruit quarterbacks. So I think on both fronts, it just makes sense when your biggest rivals are competing to win national championships. You need to go out and get somebody who can threaten them, and both of those can do it. There's other coaches who can. It just seems like those two fit the profile the most of what Auburn is looking for.
Now, I got a couple other coaches, Stephen, on my list here with SEC connections. Just give me your quick thoughts on these guys. Now, let's get to the fired guys in a second, but I've shared on this show, Stephen, I've heard it other places as well. Eli Drinkwitz last offseason angled himself to try to get this job should Brian Arson get shown the door. Now he's shown the door. Maybe some of the luster has been, off of Drink after Missouri, but hell, they just had a ranked win, Stephen. They got 4 games left, and I think 3 of them are very winnable. And who knows, maybe even I don't want to say that Tennessee game's winnable, but Tennessee coming off that Georgia game, if it's a heartbreaker against the Bulldogs, Tennessee, who knows? There could be a hangover effect. In Missouri nearly knocked off Georgia. If they nearly knocked off Georgia, then I have to believe that if they put a perfect game together, they can perhaps beat Tennessee. Let's just imagine in a world where that happens, where Missouri catches the red hot, they win 5 in a row. Would that give you any thought to Drink landing that job, or did you think maybe he blew that by how god awful his team played against Auburn earlier this year?
Yeah, I think beating Auburn certainly would have helped him. I do think, to your point, if Missouri builds a little bit of momentum down the stretch here, if they beat Kentucky, they should beat New Mexico State, and of course their games against Tennessee and Arkansas, so they have opportunities to improve the overall resume. I think it would, if you put into categories, Drinkowitz would probably be in that second tier of candidates for me. I think there are some other names who would rank higher. For instance, someone like Jeff Grimes, the offensive coordinator at Baylor, Deion Sanders as well, the Jackson State head coach. So I think he would be in the category of, if things went really crazy, like the last two, maybe the last Auburn coaching search did, he could get in there. But I don't know that there's enough there in terms of wins at this point to be able to say that's the guy they have to go out and get, unless they just strike out on everyone else.
Yeah, and you just hit on an interesting name, Stephen. A lot of these Auburn people, the fans anyway, they're excited about Deion Sanders, and coming off the game day appearance, he's doing a great job for Jackson State. But I don't know how much you follow Jackson State, Stephen. I don't follow them at all. I got to be perfectly honest. But from what I do know, is they have a better roster than everybody they're facing, with his ability to let's give him credit. He's attracted that talent down there. But to me, that's kind of like an SEC team playing a G5 team, an average G5 team every week. I mean, he should be winning those games. Do you think there's something to Deion? I mean, we do need a coach that's going to come in here and flip the talent, but I got no idea what kind of scheme he's going to be running. I got no idea how Deion is going to handle. At Jackson State, I would imagine he answers to no one. At Auburn, he's going to answer to a lot of people. This is a big-time job. This is not a circus down here. This is a team that expects to compete and win championships. Is that a sticking point for Deion, do you think?
I think it's a great question, because I do think that is an unknown in all this. If you look back at some of the coaching searches, and there's been some sort of behind the scenes, intel. And it always says, hey, people are really impressed when they interview and talk to Deion Sanders about becoming a P5 coach. There's a lot of people who think it's only a matter of time before he's a Power 5 coach. I think he's got one thing working for him that's so important, and that is recruiting. He can get talent. See Travis Hunter in last year's recruiting class. He's been great at getting people through the portal to come play at Jackson State. And of course, Deion's a great promoter too. I mean, look what he's done for that program, the spotlight being on Jackson State in some of those games in FCS. So I think that's always been the question for me, is if you go to a place like Auburn where you're dealing with so many layers of, your athletic director trying to play within the SEC, boosters, everything else, it is a different landscape to navigate. And I think that might get a little difficult for a coach like Deion. He's certainly fascinating because of his ability to pull talent, and that's what you need at a place. You need it anywhere, but at a place like Auburn. I mean, Deion Sanders going head to head with Kirby Smart and Nick Saban on the recruiting trail sounds pretty exciting, but I think that could be a potential sticking point. To saying all that, I think he will be a Power 5 coach in the near future. Don't know where it might be. Maybe it's a chance like Georgia Tech interviews in this offseason. But yeah, I would say if you're keeping a list of coaches to move up, Sanders is going to be very near the top of that list in the next couple of years.
Now, two fired SEC coaches that I think are great coaches, Stephen. I'm just curious what's your thoughts on this fit. But number one, I go to obvious connection with John Cohen, Dan Mullen, who I think he's the best coach Mississippi State's ever had. I thought he did, people will mock me for saying this, but I think he did a good job at Florida until obviously, he tried to get into the NFL. That blew up at his face and it quickly turned on him. But I mean, many New Year's Six bowls, he won the East. He nearly knocked off. His team was the closest to knock off Alabama that year. They won the national championship. This is not like some idiot that don't know what he's doing. He clearly has made mistakes. That may be a tough sell to hire someone that just got fired a year ago. But what were your thoughts be on Dan Mullen getting another opportunity in the SEC?
I think he should. I've always been really high on Dan Mullen. To your point, it's not easy to win at Mississippi State. It's the hardest job in the SEC West. And look at his track record there, consistently winning, consistently developing quarterbacks and good offenses. And we saw this at Florida too. And you mentioned that, the wheels kind of came off there at the end of 2021, but they won the SEC East in 2020. But I think the big sticking point is recruiting. And if Brian Harsin wasn't willing to recruit at the SEC level, he wasn't willing to get into the sandbox and try to compete with Kirby Smart and Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher and all these others. If Dan Mullen wasn't crazy about doing that at Florida, at a place like Auburn, I think that'd be a tough sell. But I do think looking ahead to the rest of this year's carousel or even next year, I mean, to me, Dan Mullen's a guy who should be on the sideline somewhere. Maybe it's not at Auburn. Maybe it's at another place. Maybe it's potentially West Virginia. Heck, maybe even Missouri. Maybe if Eli Drinkowitz doesn't work out. So I would expect that Mullen ends up somewhere in the future. He's just too good of an offensive coach, and there's a track record of winning at two Power 5 programs.
Now, I have no idea, Stephen, if this guy would even be interested in coming back to the SEC, but I always thought he was a really good coach, similar to Dan Mullen. The wheels fell off, and recruiting was certainly an issue. Personnel staffing was an issue towards the end. But Brett Bielema, he's doing a hell of a job at Illinois. Again, I don't really follow them, but I see that they keep winning, and I realize that's a weak division and everything. He's got the history at Arkansas. He beat a lot of really good teams when he was Arkansas's head coach. What would you think about old Bert coming back to the SEC and landing at Auburn?
I would be surprised. He seems to be right at home at Illinois and being in the Big Ten. That's kind of his roots as sort of Midwestern coach. He was the head coach, of course, at Wisconsin before he came to Arkansas, ties to Iowa, ties to Illinois. So I think he seems right at home in the Big Ten. I would be really surprised. I think, maybe he not necessarily learned a lesson last time when he went from Wisconsin to Arkansas. It was a good opportunity and a good chance to make that jump. But I think he's just right at home in the Big Ten. And so I would be surprised if he left Illinois for Auburn.
All right, last one, Stephen. South Carolina, I know they just suffered a bad loss, so people may not want to hear it, but the program's moving in the right direction. Arkansas, clearly under Sam Pittman, revitalized basically overnight. Those two programs, Stephen, and I'm not necessarily putting Auburn in their class because Auburn has competed and won for national championships and SEC championships far more recently than those two schools. But those two schools, Stephen, they looked at the landscape. It was tough to hire a coach, or maybe just, with South Carolina having to play Clemson and the SEC, with Arkansas being a little bit of an outlier, and the shenanigans with Chad Morris, it was difficult. They tried to get Kiffin. They tried to get Drink. They couldn't get these guys. They had to go down their list. They had to get a guy that loved the school. And what are your thoughts on Auburn? Because we may see something similar, Stephen, with Auburn for all the dynamics we said with the lack of leadership. Hopefully John Cohen fixes that, but you still got to play Kirby every year. You still got to play Nick Saban every year. I mean, this is an attractive job, but at the same point, you can argue it's one hell of a not attractive job as long as these two dynasties are at the height of their power. If Auburn has to go down their list and get an alum, get someone that has a clear vision, how about a guy like Georgia running back coach Dell McGee? This is not my idea. I've heard it many times before, but whether it's Dell McGee or whether it's Cadillac, what if Cadillac wins out, as improbable as that seems? Someone like that to kind of, as long as they have a clear vision and are going to land some elite coordinators. What would your thoughts be on them basically going the South Carolina and Arkansas route, hiring someone that typically you wouldn't anticipate getting this job, but maybe it's the right fit. It could work out for the Tigers.
Yeah, I actually think, to your point, I've probably been a little bit more open to that idea over the last couple of years because of the success of Shane Beamer and Sam Pittman. Like, if you would have told me that 5 years ago, I probably would have went, you probably should go out and hire a coach that's been a head coach, or he's been a high-profile coordinator. But I think what we've seen in college football is that the role of head coach has changed. You're not just out there X's and O's every week scheming. You've got to be kind of a CEO. You've got to be able to navigate roster management, NIL, being able to mesh sort of your athletic department and the boosters off the field, everything that goes around with NIL and everything like that. So you have to wear a lot of hats. And so I don't think it's the worst thing to go out and hire somebody who's got sort of that, who's really good at management, can go out and hire a staff like Sam Pittman, really good at doing those things. And if you don't spend as much on your head coach, you can go out and get top-notch coordinators. So I think in Auburn's case, they can go out and hire a high-profile head coach, which is why I would be surprised if they get down the list of names like we're talking about. I think if you are looking for maybe a couple sleeper candidates, someone like a Jeff Grimes, who was there as an offensive line coach before. He's been very successful as the offensive coordinator at BYU and Baylor. I think he'd be a long shot candidate, but certainly I think if you start talking about like, hey, who are some like tier 3 names to get in the mix, he would be one. Jamie Chadwell, Coastal Carolina, runs a very innovative, kind of fun offense. He's from Tennessee, so he sort of gets the SEC kind of experience thing. But I think all these coaches outside of the kind of the top tier that we mentioned, and Matt Rule's name has come up too. I mean, he might even be a long shot too, just because he doesn't really have SEC experience. So I think, to me, the bottom line is, what you said is true. Auburn has a lot going for it. The fact that they are willing to pay the money, they can win a national championship, they can compete at the highest level, they're willing to win. The other factors are what you have to navigate, which is sort of the booster, sort of off the field, the alignment. If all that's in line, yeah, you are going up against Kirby and Nick Saban and the rest of the SEC, but you can get a lot of talent and you can win at a high level. And which is why I think if I had to make a list of candidates, and this is just me speculating, not me reporting anything, like I think Kiffin and Freeze would be like 1A and 1B right now for Auburn.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll talk for weeks about this, but it's probably going to be the two most obvious guys going to come down to this job. But hey, we've got some ball games, Steven. So enough of Auburn. I mean, they're terrible. Let's move on. We should not even. Well, they do got a game, so we'll talk about them in a minute. But we got some real games coming up here, Steven. Tennessee at Georgia, number 1 versus number 2, according to the AP poll. That could certainly change with the playoff poll coming out this evening. But let's start with Tennessee, Stephen. What are the keys to land in a victory for the Tennessee Vols on the road against the defending national champions, #1 in the AP poll, Georgia Bulldogs?
I'm going to give you a weird answer. I think it's keep doing what you're doing. I mean, what Tennessee's doing is working, and they have the nation's best offense, scoring over 40 points a game. They're averaging over 7 yards per play. I think the line of scrimmage has been a really pleasant surprise for Tennessee coming into this year. It was a question, but they've been outstanding there. And, statistically, they're running the ball a little bit, whatever it is, a little bit more productive, however you want to word it. But they're doing that enough. And I think what's hard to defend about Tennessee is they can hurt you so many different ways with so many weapons. I mean, they just put up 44 points against a good Kentucky defense. They scored 52 on Alabama without Cedric Tillman. And now they're getting Cedric Tillman back to 100%. So I think Tennessee has aced all of its tests so far. They won at LSU. They took care of business at Kentucky. They beat Alabama. The road in Athens, of course, is going to be a little bit tougher. But I think Tennessee really just needs to pick up where it left off. And then I think on defense for Tennessee, I think you got to be able to stop Georgia's rushing attack, create some havoc around the line of scrimmage, and try to force Stetson Bennett into some of those mistakes that we saw on Saturday against Florida. Think about this if you're Tennessee. If you can get 2 takeaways and get the ball back to Hendon Hooker on short fields, that might be 14 points, and that might be enough to win what I think is going to be a close game.
Now, let me ask you this, Stevie, because I keep hearing this from Georgia people. Well, Tennessee's played Alabama, and Kirby and company, they've been able to study that film, so maybe they'll have an edge. Is that an edge for Georgia, or is that potentially an edge for Tennessee? Because I understand the personnel is different, but if the scheme is similar, Tennessee knows how to attack it. I'm sure they'll come up with some wrinkles. They're not going to do exactly what they did against Alabama, but is that really an advantage for Georgia, or how do you see that shaping out?
I think it plays into both a little bit, because I think if I'm Tennessee, like I've already had a crack at Alabama, and of course there are some similarities and things you can take away from playing Alabama that you could take away when you play Georgia. So I think Tennessee has, like we said, they've aced all the tests so far, and I think they've had that productive performance against Alabama. So they should feel confident going into this game. Being on the road in Athens, of course, compared to your home crowd in Knoxville is a little different. I think for Georgia, the biggest thing that you could take away on defense is, hey, Alabama played them and got torched, so you know what you shouldn't do. And I think one of the biggest things that Georgia's going to have to do is the small things. They're going to have to communicate better in the secondary. Kentucky, the mix-ups, I think it was twice on the same play where Tennessee's receivers just ran by the safety. Those are the kind of mistakes you can't have if you're Georgia. And also do the small things, like get stops on third down, get stops in the red zone. Don't give up some of those big plays, because sometimes when I watch Tennessee, it's almost like I don't know what defense can slow them down. You almost have to hope that Hendon Hooker just has an off day and he misses a couple passes and you can get off the field that way. So I think it works to give you a bad answer, Mike. I think it works both ways, because I do think there is some benefit from Georgia seeing Tennessee go out and play 8 times, and they've already had a crack at a similar defense. Whereas Tennessee, I mean, if you can score on Alabama, Kentucky, and LSU, I feel pretty confident you're going to be able to move the ball against Georgia. The big caveat to that is I think Georgia did a nice job containing Anthony Richardson in the pocket on Saturday. So I'm interested to see how that Georgia front matches up with Tennessee's offensive line too.
Any concern that this is only Tennessee's 3rd road game? I realize, Baton Rouge, that's a hostile place. That was an early game, but that was a little bit of a Tennessee takeover. And I would imagine most LSU fans went into that game saying, let's see how we match up against this team, not like we're going to beat them. It's certainly Tennessee was favored in Baton Rouge. I can't remember the last time that happened. And then again, the Pitt game was away, and that was a game. I know it was early. Tennessee's much better now than they were then, but Tennessee could have lost that game. So any concern for you, Stephen, that this is only the 3rd road test of the season for the Vols?
I don't think I'm necessarily concerned about the total. I'm more concerned about, if I was Tennessee, about the environment. Like I think Athens is just a really difficult place to play. So I think it's more about, a very hostile crowd. And especially if Tennessee, I think if they get off to a fast start, and that's one of the things I think when you watch Tennessee is that they almost like can stun you, because before you know it, you're down 14-3 or 14-0, you take the crowd out of the game, much like they did against LSU. That could work in Tennessee's favor. So I think because Tennessee just has so much experience on both sides of the ball, Hendon Hooker has kind of the slow heartbeat that nothing seems to phase him, whether it's the pass rush or the road environment. He doesn't make mistakes either. So I'm not worried about being Tennessee's third road game. I would just be worried about, hey, you're going into a really hostile environment. And if Georgia takes the lead earlier, it's only going to get tougher from there.
How impressive is it, Stephen, that Tennessee seems to dictate decisions week in and week out from the other coaches, whether it's Billy Napier, I mean, just going balls to the wall. You know, he refuses to kick field goals, making stupid 2-point conversion decisions. Brian Kelly, making stupid 4th down conversions. I think Nick Saban, at the end of that game, refusing to run the ball. Maybe he was just scared to death that, they had to score. They had to get close. Mark Stoops, the game plan, it just seems week in and week out, Stephen. Tennessee, their offense, how effective it is, how high pace, fast and explosive it is. These coaches, it's like they get scared to death when they get out there. I'm certainly not suggesting Kirby's going to be scared, but if Tennessee dictates this game, when I'm talking tempo and pace and all that, I think Tennessee's going to win this game. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the hard parts about playing Tennessee is, they can dictate the pace. And because of the tempo and because if they get ahead, it's really hard to stop them. I mean, we just talked about how they just put up over 50 points in Alabama, took care of business against LSU and Kentucky, and those are pretty good defenses. And so it is challenging. And this is why I think Georgia needs to get up early and take the lead and sort of force Tennessee out of their element. Because if Tennessee takes control of this game, they're scoring kind of at will, the pace of the game is really fast, and you're not getting stops. If you're Georgia, that's a real kind of danger zone right there. Whereas if you're Georgia, you come out, maybe you can get a couple long drives, you get a 3 and out, you're sort of controlling the game. Your defense isn't, struggling in the fourth quarter to keep up with the pace. I like Georgia's odds a lot more in that game. So that's a challenge when you face Tennessee, is they can hurt you so many different ways. When you're better running, you got a quarterback who can make all the right reads in the scheme. He can hurt you with his legs. You have 3 or 4 great receivers in this scheme, and then the offensive line has stepped up. They can just hurt you so many ways. And because of the pace and because of their ability to pretty much score from anywhere in the field, I think that's why you see coaches make those decisions. You almost have to go into the game thinking, hey, we're going to have to score 40 points to probably win this game.
Yeah, and I can hear people now, Stevens, quit slobbering on Tennessee. Mike, let's talk Georgia. Number one for a reason. I mean, Brock Bowers, Darnell Washington, they could legitimately have 300 receiving yards in this game because they're not going to have a single player that matches up with these guys. How critical are those two pieces for Georgia in this matchup?
Huge, significant. I don't know if that's important, if I'm not emphasizing it enough for either team. Because I think if you're Tennessee, you've got to find a way to make somebody other than Brock Bowers or Darnell Washington beat you. If A.D. Mitchell comes back and Ladd McConkey and those guys beat you, you take your hat off and say congrats. But if Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington have a huge game here for Georgia, it's tough to see Tennessee winning. And it's not just that they're so good in the open field. They're just hard to match up with. They're hard to defend because they move so well. They're so physically impressive. And we saw the catch on Saturday against Florida. So for me, I think that if you're Tennessee, you let other people other than those two guys beat you. I don't know how you do it because Tennessee's just been so porous against the pass. I know they had a great game against Kentucky on Saturday, but I'm betting that Georgia's OL will hold up a lot better than Kentucky's did.
Yeah, I'm glad you referenced that, Stephen, because in my opinion, Georgia's offensive line far and away the best Tennessee will have seen this season, and it really seems like they are getting that ground game going several weeks in a row. Do you agree with all that?
100%. I think that's a reason to like Georgia's chances in this game. Is we go back to tempo and we talk about pace and controlling the game. Time of possession is kind of overrated, but I think I'll take my chances by putting Georgia's running backs and offensive line into a position where they can control the pace of the game, and maybe you wear out Tennessee's defense in the fourth quarter, especially if you can get a couple stops of Tennessee's offense and keep them on the fields. And in the big picture, like, this is the question with Georgia, is they have all the pieces to win it. They dominated Oregon in the first game of the year. They have that extra gear that they can reach, and it feels like they might be getting there, but I think we'll find out more this Saturday of whether or not all those pieces that we've talked about all year are ready to come together. And I like what they've done on the ground and on the offensive line this last couple weeks of the season.
And how dangerous do you think it is, Stephen, that I would imagine all week, all non-Georgia people are going to be saying, well, Tennessee's going to have a major advantage at quarterback when this explosive offense, and here Georgia's got a guy that was MVP of the Orange Bowl, MVP of the national championship game. He's something like 27-3 as a starting quarterback, yet he's going to be somewhat of an afterthought going into this matchup. I would imagine Tennessee is going to force Stetson to beat him, and he is fully capable of doing that. And you just mentioned it. I mean, last week was incredible what Tennessee's defense did against Will Levis, but I think he's banged up. I think his receiver is a little bit banged up. The offensive line is horrible. Could this be a game where Stetson Bennett goes off, and I don't know what the numbers would be, but maybe like 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, something like that?
Yeah, I'm expecting a big game from Stetson Bennett on Saturday. And I hate to be Captain Obvious and say that, but Tennessee's just been so bad against the pass that I expect that he'll have a lot of time to throw. I expect him to find open receivers. I expect Kirby Smart to tell him all week, hey, you're the number 2 quarterback in this game. Look at, he's going to print off every Heisman poll that's on the internet and print it up in the locker room. And it shows Hendon Hooker's at the top of the Heisman list and nobody believes in Stetson Bennett. And hey, every time that happens, he delivers, and he delivered it, like you said, in the playoffs. So I expect that, much like he has throughout his career at Georgia, Bennett will be doubted, and he'll probably deliver on Saturday. That's why he's the mailman, after all.
Yep. All right, and then we've got another epic clash here, Stephen. Alabama at LSU. Let's focus on Alabama first. Of course, as well as Jaden Daniels is playing, and he's playing incredible for LSU. I've said it many times before. I think he's the most valuable player to his team in the SEC. He ain't Bryce Young. Bryce Young's on a different level. The thoughts on Alabama heading into this matchup with 2 weeks to prepare. But again, it was a week ago we were talking here, Stephen. You said, well, hell, Mississippi State statistically outplayed Alabama. It was an interesting game. This is a tough spot, I think, because it's a night game. It's on the road. We've seen Alabama beat itself. I don't want to say beat itself, but hell, penalties were an issue at Texas and obviously at Tennessee, cost them the ball game. If they play like that again, if they have all these penalties and a turnover here or there, could just be one turnover, I fully think LSU can win this football game. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I think if this game was in Tuscaloosa, I think we probably see the spread at maybe 17 points. I'm a little surprised it's 13. It feels a little high on first evaluation in this game. I think the reason, if you're LSU, to believe that you can win this game is 2 things. I think it's the way that Jaden Daniels was playing against Ole Miss in Florida. Maybe the off week came at the worst possible time because he was red hot in those games. And, LSU's defensive adjustments against Ole Miss, the way they adjusted after falling behind was really nice. And I think if you're LSU, you have to be very optimistic about kind of how this team has progressed since the start of the season. It's on the road. And we've seen what Alabama has done on the road for the last 2 years. You mentioned it. They almost lost at Texas. They lost to Tennessee. Even dating back to 2021, they had problems. So I think if I'm LSU, that's where I start my list of reasons to be optimistic. Jaden Daniels, those receivers, and the fact that the game is at night in Death Valley. You're going to get a very loud LSU crowd, and Alabama has struggled with that. So those would be the 2 biggest reasons for optimism if I'm LSU.
Do you think this could potentially be a low-scoring game, though, Stephen? Because I would imagine LSU's defensive line going up against Alabama's offensive line in Death Valley, that matchup favors the Tigers, whereas Alabama's front seven versus LSU's offensive line, I think I don't care where the game's played, Stephen. I think that's a matchup that clearly favors Alabama. So this could be a little bit of a train wreck of offensive line play. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost like we're going to see Tennessee and Georgia probably, both threaten 40 points on Saturday. And this game is probably going to be played at a much different level. It could end up in the 40s or so for both teams, but I would be surprised. I think to your point, we're going to talk a lot about Bryce Young. We're going to talk about Jaden Daniels and all the skill talent that's going to be in this game. But I think the lines of scrimmage are where this game is going to be decided. Can LSU, with the crowd noise and the pass rush of Ojolari and some of those other guys, can they cause havoc? I mean, we've seen it bother Alabama before. Bryce Young has had 2 weeks to get even healthier from the shoulder injury. I expect that he's going to play well, but I think LSU's front can cause some problems. On the other side of things, I mean, Mike, you mentioned it. I mean, Will Anderson, Dallas Turner, those Alabama linebackers going up against LSU's offensive line seems like a mismatch for LSU. So I that's where Jaden Daniels' mobility could really come into play here, and doing some things with his legs, moving him around in the pocket and getting those receivers involved. So maybe if you're LSU, you could study that Tennessee tape and see if there's some things you could do on offense, maybe to mimic some of the things that Tennessee's done well against Alabama.
And do you think special teams could play a factor in this outcome? I mean, LSU at times has just been dreadful on special teams. Alabama, they've missed some big kicks this season. Could, a disaster here or there, could that cost either one of these teams this game?
Absolutely. I think especially if you're LSU, I think if you're LSU, you're the underdog in this game. You don't have the margin for error that Alabama does. I mean, Alabama's the better team. They come into this game favored. They've got Bryce Young and Will Anderson, two of the top 5 players in college football. If you're LSU, the roster's still under construction, but you're definitely making progress. And you cannot afford to have a fumble on a punt, a blocked punt. And I think if you're Alabama too, I mean, field goals, I mean, we've seen them, at Tennessee, it was a problem. So yeah, I think special teams, if you're looking for the X factor on Saturday, if the game is close, a turnover or two might decide it. And we've seen LSU have some issues on special teams. That's something that Brian Polian and Brian Kelly will have to get addressed for this week.
Now, this may be looking ahead a little too far, Stephen, but let's just say LSU wins this game. Because at times Bryce Young's had to been like incredible, like making, on the run throws that are Aaron Rodgers could barely make. You know what I mean? And yet Alabama's either barely winning or even losing when he's playing like that. So I don't think it's too hard to imagine if he's just, shows up with his B game and they drop. Is the dynasty dead? That may be too far. But, does Alabama strike fear, do you think, in these SEC teams? Because I'm not seeing it here lately. And again, if you lose 2 road games and you got Ole Miss on deck, which is, they just won a big one themselves. I mean, it's not insane to say Alabama could drop 3 conference games this year. What's your thoughts on that?
It would be surprising to see Alabama lose like 2 in a row on the road, but I don't think it's crazy to think that they're more vulnerable than they have been. I think you mentioned it there. The thing that stands out to me is when watching Alabama, I mean, Bryce Young has to be, Superman sometimes in the fourth quarter to win some of these games. And the Alabama just seems to be playing more close games than they have. And also, I think if you're LSU, you could look and go, hey, Tennessee beat them earlier this year. Last year was Texas A&M. Georgia beat them in the national championship. I don't think maybe the psychology works in LSU's favor that they see other teams beating Goliath in the SEC and they say, hey, we've got them coming to our place now, and now we can try and knock them off. So I think Alabama is more vulnerable than they have been. And I think looking ahead, this game means a lot for the SEC West, but you've got the Lane train with 2 weeks to get ready in Oxford. I don't think we should, write Alabama in pen for the SEC championship game just yet. I think we got to see them get past Ole Miss.
All right. How about this one, Stephen? Florida at Texas A&M. My God, I said this on yesterday's show, Stephen, but it's the loser is going to be 1-5 in the SEC. That is just unacceptable. Man, I mean, and I realize Billy Napier in year 1, so we give him a little bit of a pass, but still, that's not the standard in Gainesville. Jimbo, we've kind of kicked that guy to death, so I'm not going to sit here and do that anymore. But this is two teams with a lot of talent. They've not lived up to it. But let me ask you this, Steve, because this is something I was thinking about today. Anthony Richardson, so much hype. We've seen him play incredibly at times, but he's obviously too inconsistent for a lot of people's likings. We've only seen Connor Wigman in 2 games and only 1 start. He looked incredible in that 1 start, albeit against a pretty bad Ole Miss defense. If I was to tell you right now, Stephen, this was like some kind of fantasy football world, you could build around Anthony Richardson or you could build around Connor Wigman. Who are you taking?
I play college fantasy football. That probably shows you how much of a college football sicko I am. If you're asking about college fantasy football, I want Anthony Richardson for his mobility. But I think long term, it's tough to call because I think when I watch Anthony Richardson, I see the arm talent, and then I see some throws where it's like, if you just put a little bit more air on it, a little bit more touch, you could land those. And so I would probably pick Connor Wagman, I guess, if I'm looking like to start a quarterback long term. But I will say this: I'm fairly optimistic that Billy Napier is going to get this figured out in Gainesville. I don't think that the roster was built.
Apparently, you didn't hear that reporter today. Did you hear that?
I did. I did hear that. Yeah. Oh man, nice. Thank you for the hot mic moment there. That was great. No, I think. I'm pretty optimistic about Napier because I think he gets it in the SEC, and I think it's just going to take some time to recruit. I think if you want to make an optimistic case for Anthony Richardson in the scenario you mentioned there, I think he's gotten better since last season. Now, the bar wasn't set very high, but he's better. And I think if you go out and get some playmakers around him, some guys who are as good as maybe Evan Stewart is going to be, then I think you could see the offense jump, and especially with another offseason to work under Billy Napier. My biggest question with A&M is, we've seen, Haynes King, we've seen Max Johnson, now we've seen Connor Wagman. I think he's easily the best of the 3 quarterbacks. I mean, what he did on Saturday in his first start and against an SEC opponent was really impressive. Now, can you build something for the rest of the year and 2023 that continues to build on that? So maybe it's a bad answer. Maybe I'm just too patient. But if I was Florida, I wouldn't sell my Anthony Richardson stock just yet.
Right. So my question obvious is why in the hell has Wigman not been playing more? And let me ask you this, Stevie, because this is something I asked Cousin Shane on the last episode. Let's say, and I mean they're celebrating. They scored 28 points in a ball game down there in College Station with one of the top rosters in the country going up against one of the worst defenses in the SEC. If they continue to trend well with Wagman under center, could that ultimately be a bad thing? Because then Jimbo's going to sit here and say, well, we got this. This offense is great. We got a quarterback, and then we're going to get the same old next season.
Yes, that is my fear if I'm Texas A&M. My fear is, hey, we do too well. Jimbo says, I've got this ridiculous buyout. I don't have to listen to anybody else. If I want to call the plays and keep building the offense, I can do that. I don't have to listen to any of you guys. So, yeah, I think there is a case of where you're A&M if you want to win these games and also maybe put a little bit of pressure on Jimbo somehow, like maybe the offense sputters late in the year. If you look at their schedule, they get, Florida at Auburn, UMass, and then LSU. I think they can get to 6 wins out of that. Like, it's not going to be easy, but I think they're favored against Florida. I think they'll be favored at Auburn, and they should take care of business against UMass. But, yeah, there's a fine line between success and having a better offense the last month of the season and then thinking ahead to 2023. I think we have enough data and we have enough evidence on Jimbo that he needs to give up play calling and sort of modernize the offense. That'd be my hope if I'm A&M, is that there's enough smart people at the school with boosters and everybody else that just comes to him and say, look, you got to do it. And that they make a change for next year at offensive coordinator and force Jimbo to give up play calling duties.
If he's really trying to get that buyout money, maybe he'll hire Marcus Satterfield to be his offensive coordinator. But let me ask you this matchup, Stephen. Florida, I mean, they're a machine on the ground. They got a 3-headed monster with obviously Anthony Richardson, Montrell Johnson, and ETN, the freshman. A&M, all of a sudden, they've fallen apart on defense. Can't stop the run. they were like 2 yards away, Stephen, from giving up more rushing yards than they've given up in their program history. And I realize Ole Miss is also a rushing machine, so that's skewed a little bit. But do you think Florida can make this competitive with their ground game? Obviously, you want Anthony Richardson to show up and be as good as he can, but even if he's not, they may be able to pound A&M into submission. Thoughts on that?
Agree with you. Yeah, I think that's where, if I'm Florida, you have to chart a winning path. Is you have to be able to run ETN, Richardson, and Montrell Johnson. And I like the fact, if I'm Florida, that ETN seems to be getting more involved. Like, he seems to be like one of those guys that going forward, Florida needs more of. They need more guys who can be explosive with the ball in their hands, and he's certainly one of them. And with the way that A&M played against the run against Ole Miss, giving up whatever, how many yards it was, they're going to be vulnerable there on Saturday. I think it's probably going to be hard for Florida, much like we saw on Saturday. I know they hit a few big plays, but to have that consistency through the air. So if Florida's going to win this game, it's going to have to be on the ground game with Richardson and the two backs leading the way.
All right, now how about this one, Stephen? Kentucky at Missouri. Is this going to be like first one to 14 points wins it?
I was going to say, if you're looking at some over-unders this week, or maybe you want to get in on the wager app like I am, maybe you want to take the under perhaps, because Kentucky and Missouri is probably not going to be many points here. It's shaping up to be, I think, a pretty close game. And I think you're right. Like, first one to 20, 24 might be enough. Missouri, that win last week was huge, just when you start thinking about bowl eligibility and trying to get to 6 wins. Like, they need to steal 1 or 2 of these. And this is another opportunity to do so. Also, not a great matchup for Kentucky's offensive line. And especially with the way Missouri gets after you in terms of sack production, tackles for loss. They had trouble last week against Tennessee. I think Missouri can create some problems there as well. So really is probably going to be one of the lower scoring games in the SEC this week. It may not match the Missouri South Carolina over under, but it's definitely going to be low scoring.
Yeah, now it seems like Chris Rodriguez is banged up. Will Levis has been banged up for a while. Maybe that's playing into why he's playing so poorly. I don't know, Stephen. Where's the psychology of this team, do you think? After losing to Tennessee, they're going to lose to Georgia, unless some miracle happens. What have they got left to play for there in Lexington, aside from pride? I'm very, very concerned this is going to be a letdown performance. And if memory serves, Stephen, they're not even been successful on their road trips against Missouri.
Yeah, I think it's like Kentucky has won 6 out of the last 7 overall, but I think 3 of the last 4 in this series decided by 1 score. Like, it's usually been pretty close between these two teams. So that goes to your point of, playing Missouri well. I think if I'm Kentucky, I would be sort of worried about psychology. You're coming off the loss to Tennessee, and it was a convincing fashion. You have a team that's banged up, not to mention, Mark Stoops this week at his press conference kind of putting the pressure on Scangranello to figure it out offensively, maybe to try and simplify some things. It really starts at the line of scrimmage, though, for Kentucky. If Missouri is getting into the backfield, creating negative plays, and Kentucky's in 3rd and long all game, even if Will Levis at 80% with the good playmakers that they have at receiver, it's not a great recipe. So it's really, this game might be about who can avoid so many negative plays, because both of these offenses have trouble staying on schedule. So that kind of goes to our discussion on low scoring game. I think Will Levis is the better quarterback here, but a couple plays, big play or turnover or 2 might tilt this one in one favor.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Stephen, because Brady Cook, I thought he played one of the best games he's played. I thought he played pretty well against Georgia too. But if they can get a consistent performance out of Brady Cook, the offense, South Carolina's defense is no joke, and they were very effective. But let me ask you this, after seeing Drink's offense for a couple of years at different places as well as Missouri, does he know you're allowed to throw the ball 10 yards down the field? Everything's a damn dink and dunk and jet sweep and all this. Do you think that's because the offensive line is so questionable, or what the hell's going on with that?
I think it's an offensive line thing for sure. I mean, Missouri probably, if you ranked offensive lines in the SEC, Missouri's definitely 12th, 13th, 14th, depending on which metric you use. I think that's a big part of it. I think it's just pass protection, not being able to, let the quarterback stay in the pocket for too long. I think, going forward, one of the things for me is, and Mike, maybe you and I need to start an online petition or something, but we got to get Luther Burden the ball, and we got to get the ball to him 10 or 15 times a game, man, because, he's just such a different, playmaker. When you watch Missouri, like, he's so explosive with the ball in his hands, and for him to, to only touch the ball a couple times just isn't enough. But broadly, to your point, I thought that was one of the better games that Brady Cook has played. They really used that short passing game effectively, and they set up a couple of those deep shots to love it. So that was a nice game plan against a pretty good defense for Missouri. We'll see if they can have the same success against Kentucky's defense this week, but that was the right way to win last week.
Well, and speaking of South Carolina, Stephen, they play at Vanderbilt, and that spread, it opened only as a touchdown favorite in favor of the Gamecocks on the road, of course. But this is a game, Stephen, where Vanderbilt nearly knocked off South Carolina at home last season. They needed some late game heroics by Connor Nolan, who he's going to be a trivia question years down the line for GA becoming quarterback here. But, now all of a sudden, Gamecocks, they're not going to fire Bieber, but I mean, we went from cloud nine, we're ranked, we're 5-2. Now it's like, oh my God, we got this coordinator, Spencer Rattler's not getting it done, this, that, and the other. I mean, I'm not putting Beamer on the hot seat, but I don't think it's out of the question that they drop this game. They shouldn't, but I'm sitting here thinking, hell, if they lose to Missouri at home, they can potentially lose to Vanderbilt, and it's almost like so much pressure now, everybody going to play Vanderbilt, where you cannot lose to this team. Otherwise, you're going to be a damn laughingstock of the league. How much pressure is on South Carolina to get this win in Nashville?
A lot, because I think if you look at their schedule coming up, they go to Florida, they get Tennessee, and they go to Clemson to close the season. I think they'll probably be, for sure, underdogs in two of those. I think they'll be an underdog of Florida. They got to get Vanderbilt, I think, if they want to go to a bowl game. I think, to your point, we were really high, I think, on South Carolina, but also kind of opening up the hood after the game against Texas A&M. And when you looked under there, you saw that they were outgained by A&M, the special teams, the turnovers, like the margin for error by South Carolina in some of these games, they're right there on the edge, and you can't live off of turnovers and defensive and special team scores. So they needed more out of their offense. And even knowing all of that, I thought for sure at home they would take care of business against Missouri. Obviously, I was very wrong about that. So they got to get this one. But, when you look at this, Vanderbilt's only a 7-point dog at home. And it was also one of the closest games that Vanderbilt played in the SEC, like you mentioned last year. So I don't think it's crazy to think that Vanderbilt can win this game. I mean, they're better in year two under Clark Lee. They're not there yet. They have 48 tackles for a loss this year. Can they cause some havoc, much like Missouri did last week against South Carolina's offensive line? So I think this is a very gettable game for Vanderbilt, and why you see the point spread right around a touchdown.
If they fail to score 30, well, that's not a lot of points, but for Vandy, that would be if they fail to score 28 points against Vanderbilt, which, all due respect, they got the worst unit in the conference, I think, with their defense. It's they got some nice pieces coming, but their offense way better than their defense. If South Carolina can't score 28 on this defense, should they fire Marcus Satterfield on Sunday?
I think so. I mean, I think they need to move on at the end of the year. I mean,
right.
I sort of got a good laugh.
You've been trying to fire him for about a month anyway, so I should have known you were going to say that.
Right. Yeah, I kind of got a good laugh out of Cousin Shane tweeting out the play that it's a screen, and then it was a screen on against Missouri. But yeah, I mean, it's too boring. It's very predictable. I think there are some personnel deficiencies, but I think if you're South Carolina, if you want to get from here to here in the SEC, you've got to get better on offense. Also, I think if you study what South Carolina, and let's use Tennessee as an example, the term proof of concept is important when it comes to new coaches. And what I mean by that is if you come in and you have a lot of hype behind the hire, a lot of good things in the offseason, it has to translate onto the field at some point, or your tenure starts to go back. I'm not suggesting that's what's happening with South Carolina, but I think at some point, they got to a bowl game last year. They exceeded expectations. They need to get to one this year. You have to put proof of concept together and start showing improvement on offense to take that next step forward, because at some point you sort of level off. It feels like South Carolina is still going up, and if they want to continue to go up, they've got to make changes on offense and get it to the next level. So that would be my concern about South Carolina is, can they find the right mix at coordinator for next season? If it's Satterfield, what kind of changes can he make? South Carolina was really attractive in the portal to a lot of receivers, and of course Spencer Rattler. That's all in danger of going away if you don't make improvement and put forth some sort of better vision on offense. Is that crazy to think?
No, that's a really good point. So let me ask you this. Speaking of the portal, someone that's going to have to hit it hard, Stephen, Auburn at Mississippi State. It's impossible to tell what Auburn's going to look like now because Harson's gone. But early reports, they're saying they're going to run the hell out of the ball. So I got to thank God. Let's take the ball. Let's get him involved here. This was the game last season. I was foolish enough. I don't know if it was during this game. I think they had just beaten Arkansas. Yeah, and they were up 28-3. I said, man, Brian Harsin, we got to put him up for SEC Coach of the Year. He lost 5 in a row. But, hey, so there's history here. This is the first time Mississippi State's been favored by a dozen over Auburn probably in their existence. Is this going to be an easy win for Mississippi State? What's your thoughts?
I don't know if it'll be easy. And it's sort of a weird trend in college football. If you look at teams that have made a coaching change this year, the interim coaches give the team a bounce right away, whether it's week 1 or week 2. There is a little bit of caveat to that, and some of those teams had an off week to get ready. Some of those coaches, I think it's fair to say, like, how well were they playing before? Auburn wasn't playing great, but they also weren't just getting run out of the stadiums. I mean, they were competing against Ole Miss just a few weeks ago. So, I think they were fighting under the last staff, under Harsin, and of course they've made some other coaching changes too. I think that's something that I'm trying to figure out, like, if I'm Auburn, like who's going to be calling the plays, who's going to be in charge of the offense. That would be an X factor going into this game. But hey, Cadillac's the head coach. I think we can make a list of players who need to be involved more. It's Luther Burden and Tate Bigsby this year in the SEC. I expect a heavy dose of him. And then I think if you're Auburn on defense, can you sort of use that front to slow down Will Rogers and that Mississippi State pass rush? So, hey, interim coaches have given teams a bump. So I think if you're Auburn, maybe optimistically, that question that was hanging over the program is no longer there. And maybe they can just go out, play loose, and on the road where they're 13, 14-point favorite, hey, they've got nothing to lose behind a coach that they should probably play pretty hard for.
It's kind of impossible to tell because Mississippi State's been so inconsistent, but they desperately need to get this one because they've got some key games down the stretch, hosting Georgia in the evening. They're going to be probably 20-point underdog at home, so I'm not suggesting that they can win that game, but hell, crazier things can happen. But I don't think there's any shot if they don't get this one that they can get that one. They've got to get that ball rolling. And just imagine, Stephen, if they do beat them, then they set up just an incredible Egg Bowl towards the tail end of the season. So still a lot to play for Mississippi State, but they've got to show some consistency. What will you be looking for the Bulldogs in this matchup?
Yeah, I think that's right, Mike. I think consistency for sure, because we see them after the game against Arkansas, looked really good in that game, came down to earth on the road against Kentucky. And I think it really is sort of a, consistency, putting it all together. You look at their remaining schedule the rest of the year after this game against Auburn. You mentioned the game against Georgia and Ole Miss. They have East Tennessee State, so they should get to a bowl game. But I think if you want to sort of exceed preseason expectations, take the program up a notch, it's getting to that 7 sort of win mark. And so that kind of counts on beating Auburn this week, getting East Tennessee State, and then you set up maybe a showdown against Ole Miss with maybe a chance to jump back in the top 25 if you win that game on Thanksgiving.
Now, final game here, Stephen, held off on this one, not because I don't think it's going to be a great matchup, but just because it's a non-conference here. Liberty at Arkansas. A lot on the line for old Hugh Freeze and company here. And Sam Pittman, I mean, you can't be losing to Liberty. This is a weird place to put this game. Liberty's ranked, but they're a 14-point underdog in this matchup. So maybe a little extra motivation for Liberty and company. What can you tell us about this Liberty team under Hugh Freeze?
Yeah, I think the first thing is Hugh Freeze. And, Liberty has gotten quite a bit better under Hugh Freeze. You mentioned it. They're 7-1. They're ranked in some top 25s. They're 33-12 under Hugh Freeze. I think in comparison to Cincinnati, I think that's a good kind of line of markation for Arkansas. I don't think Liberty is as good as Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati's a better team. So I think if you're Arkansas, that's probably why the spread is 13. They've also played a Power 5 team this year. They played Wake Forest. They lost by a point. I would also give you a little bit of caution about reading too much into that game because Wake Forest played Clemson the next week. So I wondered if Wake Forest was just simply looking past Liberty to get to Clemson. But they are very capable of keeping this game closer than I think 13 points. From pretty balanced from a team perspective. Offensively, you look at some of the weapons they have. Day Hunter is a good running back who transferred in from Hawaii. Demario Douglas at receivers is another playmaker to watch. Their quarterback situation is really interesting. You may remember Caden Salter, another old friend of the SEC. He's been banged up. They also have Charlie Brewer, who was at Baylor. He was at Utah. He could be coming back from injury, but Jonathan Bennett has been their starting quarterback the last couple games. So they sort of had a revolving door at quarterback, but overall they've been productive on offense, been pretty solid on defense. If you're Arkansas, maybe some areas that you could take advantage of. They have been giving the ball away pretty generously this year. So lost turnovers and also pass protection. They've given up 23 sacks. So if you're Arkansas, line of scrimmage and a couple takeaways should be a pretty good formula to win this game on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Auburn, Stephen, if Liberty beats Arkansas on the road when you couldn't beat Arkansas at home last week, I mean, you got to just turn around and hire Hugh. And I've seen reports, he just got a new extension at Liberty. From what I understand, what that extension did was lower his buyout. So, I mean, some maneuvering there, and who knows if he even signed that damn deal because these agents like to share this information and then people run with it. It's all part of the plan, Stephen. But let me ask you this. Should Arkansas, the way they're running the ball, the way they're throwing it, I mean, their offense is hitting high gear once again. Should Liberty give them any resistance whatsoever as long as they don't turn the ball? I know Auburn's been having some fumbling issues. Arkansas has been having some fumbling issues. But aside from that, does Liberty have any shot at stopping this Arkansas attack?
I think if Arkansas shows up, much like they did against BYU, they should win this game. I think, but what worries me for Arkansas is kind of the sandwich effect. They just went on the road and beat Auburn. Now they've got LSU, Ole Miss, and Missouri to close out the season. And you're playing a Liberty team that, even though they're ranked, the advanced metrics have them down in the 70s. And, you can sort of look at some of their results and they only beat Gardner-Webb by a point. Like they seem to play up and play down to teams this year. And that makes them hard to read into. But, they're coming off an off week. So they've had some time to get ready for this game. And I think that's why it makes it dangerous for Arkansas. Some of those set up metrics about this game is the time off and the SEC schedule for Arkansas. But if they show up and play their A game and Jefferson and Sanders with the edge I think Arkansas has at the line of scrimmage, they should win this game. If Liberty wins, you can bet for sure Hugh Freeze is sending the U up text to the Auburn family there.
And final thing I got for you, Stephen, assuming Arkansas wins this game, they do have LSU and Ole Miss coming up, both at home, both after facing Alabama. So much was made about Arkansas and how daunting their schedule is, and it is. I'm not sitting here saying it was an easy slate, but does that set up very well for Arkansas, considering they're getting these games at home, considering they may, there's a very good likelihood they're both coming off losses playing Alabama. To me, that sets up very well for the Razorbacks.
It really does. And not to mention, you get Ole Miss a week before they play Mississippi State. So you sort of get the look ahead from that game. I love the way Arkansas' schedule sets up. And you and I have talked before that, they had that rough patch in the middle of the season, but there were some factors in there. I mean, they played Alabama. They had the crazy loss to A&M. KJ Jefferson didn't play against Mississippi State. They have a chance with that schedule and the timing and the home games and that they pick up where they left off against Auburn. They have a chance, I think, to finish in the top 25. So I don't know that they'll win all those games, but I think you start looking, 3 out of the 4 at home, and your road game in there is against the Missouri team you'll probably be favored to win. I think that sets up well for Arkansas to finish fast. So if I'm a Razorback fan, I feel pretty optimistic about my chances of getting back into the top 25, finishing with 8, maybe 9 wins this year.
All right, Stephen, I really appreciate all the time you've given me. Before you go, can you remind the audience where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. At Athlon Stephen on Twitter. You can also check out my writings at athlonsports.com. My YouTube channel is all CFB 365. And if you like talking college football, swing by Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern time, Twitter Spaces. Would love to have some fans come by and talk some SEC with us. So 11 a.m. Eastern time, Monday mornings, come hang out with us on Twitter Spaces.
All right, so just want to say thanks again, Stephen, for joining the show. I hope you guys appreciate those conversations as much as I do. They really are the highlight of my Monday evening. That's when we record those. But hey, that's going to do it for this episode of the show. We got Cousin Shane, the Tennessee Homer, coming back. We're going to be previewing all these matchups upcoming. We've got tons of great games. Shane, he wants to talk his candidates for the Auburn job. So I can't wait to hear what the Homers got to say on this one. So should be a good one on tomorrow's episode. But I want to appreciate each and every one of you for continuing to support the show. We'll catch you on the next one.